The next thing I'd like to talk about is what's called masking, how you can mask a sound. If two frequencies are close to each other, one will mask the other and you can't quite hear both of them distinctly. Noise can mask a sine wave. Let's say I'm lecturing in this room and outside they're playing a football game and there's a lot of noise coming in. It's not just the distraction of the football game, it's the noise floor that's going to make what I'm saying much less able to be understood. So when you're working with music, you really want to make sure that you get really non-distorted signals, as little noise as you can get into the whole picture, because it'll mask a lot of the distinction in the different sound elements. Masking is a really important concept. When you're mixing, there's so many times I can't tell you, people have come to me and said, how come I can't get the bass and the kick drum and the low end of the piano that I can hear it all real well? It's like all too much or it's too little, and I can't balance that properly. And that's a really hard thing to do because low frequencies have a lot of energy and one is masking the other, and you push the other one up and then you hear too much of that, you don't hear the other one, and so on. Frequencies have to be different enough so that you can perceive the two sounds and they don't mask each other. If I'm doing a kick drum and a bass guitar, your kick drum has low frequency at 60 cycle. It also has an attack when the drum's being hit, the click of the drum. That's a higher frequency, probably 1 to 2 kilohertz. And your bass guitar has an attack when they pluck it, and it has the low frequency down at 60 cycles again. So these two sounds are very similar in a lot of ways. Typically what I'll do is I'll take one sound and make space in it, spectrum, for the other sound if I'm trying to blend them together. Not just try to lay them on top of each other, but take the kick drum and hollow out some of the frequencies down around 1 to 200 hertz so that the bass can fit in that area. And then I'll have some distinction between frequency bands. I'll be able to hear the kick and the bass together at equal levels, working together to make one low-end picture rather than both of them competing for the same space. Critical bands are really important, and I'm sure that everybody that's worked with some sort of a digital recording device has looked at EQs. They all have high frequency, mid frequency, low frequency, or 4-band, 5-band, 7-band, and they break up the spectrum into different regions. Needless to say, there's a couple methods to mix. One of the methods that's used quite often, mostly in hip-hop and rap, is, okay, I've got a kick drum. I'm going to take out all the frequencies that aren't low end. Oh, I've got a cymbal. I'm going to take everything that's low out of it and just leave high. So you basically separate sounds and sound elements into critical bands of their own, and then they never conflict with each other because they don't have anything that can conflict with each other sonically. Then the mixing goes so much easier. But it's not really real. It's not really realistic because even the hi-hat has low frequencies and even the kick drum has high frequencies. What happens if you get a piano with all these frequencies? The idea is understanding that these critical bands can be separated and you can manipulate sounds, but when you manipulate sounds, if you want something to sound real, you don't over-exaggerate one band of frequencies than another, and you kind of make it sound like the real perspective and balance of, say, a piano. Not too much high frequency, not too much low. You've got to balance those things according to what a real piano sounds like. But because this is an art form, if you want to, you can go ahead and twist sounds way out of normal perspective and create something totally uniquely different than what it would really sound like. It all depends on what kind of sound you're trying to communicate, what kind of mood you're trying to communicate. What happens if you're listening to a sound that's actually really short, 200 milliseconds short, a little pulse of sound? At some point when it gets small enough, you don't really perceive it as a sound because it doesn't have enough time to actually move the air to move your eardrum, and you can perceive it. So you have to have a certain amount of time that also corresponds to energy to move your eardrum. Localization of sound, right? We talked about it briefly, about how we can determine where a sound comes from. Has anybody thought about how we can determine where a sound comes from and how important it is? Not only perhaps when we were cavemen back in our survival, right? Because we hear, oh, there's danger, we better run the other way. If we didn't know where it was coming from, we could run into danger, right? Instead of away from it. But the real issue is Tomorrow I'm sitting there mixing and I want to put the hi-hat on the right side and the shaker on the left side because they're playing two syncopated rhythms, and I want to get a separation so I can really feel the syncopations rather than putting them in the same place. How do we determine that? The reason we have two ears is for localization of sound. If we had one ear, we could only hear in mono. We couldn't tell direction. Just like two eyes allows us to see in perspective. We get two different views of the same subject, and our brain puts it together into 3 dimensions. Same thing with hearing. When I'm standing here talking to you and somebody out there is making noise on the other side of the door, I know it's coming from that side because sound comes through, hits this ear first, this ear second, and my brain calculates the phase difference between the sounds and says, oh, it's coming from there. Our positioning is very, very good. We can really determine where something comes from. It's not only because of the time difference that it takes to get from one ear to the next, it's the actual frequency position difference in the cycle. So if we've got a high frequency sound, maybe 2 kilohertz or upper mid-range frequency sound, and the wavelength is only 2 centimeters, when it hits this ear and this ear, the wave is going to be in a different position, and so we can really determine it. But let's say from this side of the room comes 40 cycles, like a really low frequency sound. Am I going to be able to understand where it's coming from? The distance between my ears is not great enough for there to be any substantial change in the phase of the wave from ear to ear. But let's take a hypothetical for a second. Let's pretend I'm an elephant and my head's 10 feet wide and my ears are 10 feet apart, and 100 cycles at 100 hertz is about 20 feet. That means that I'll be able to determine direction at 100 cycles because this ear is going to perceive it in one part of the cycle and this ear is going to perceive it at a different part. So I can hear directionality down to lower frequencies. Now I've got a theory, and this isn't proven, but this is just my own personal theory, so take it for what it's worth. Why is it that elephants would need to hear lower frequency directionality more than, say, a bobcat? Well, my theory is because they're so big, it takes a long time for them to get out of the way of the stampeding caribou. And so if they didn't know where it was coming from, the rumble of the stampede, they wouldn't know that danger was coming, and they get the pre-warning so that they could get out of the way quicker. The smaller the animal, the smaller the ear distance, they don't know directionality except at higher frequencies. And so they don't really know where it's coming from until you can hear the high frequencies of a sound. But they're so small, they're agile. They can run fast or jump into a tree or get out of the way fast. But it makes sense to me that if I was in the jungle and I saw the elephants running that way, I'd be following them, right? Because they'd know before I did that there was danger. So it's the width of your head that matters. We can't, as humans, hear directionality down below, say, 100 hertz. And that means that when you put a subwoofer into your speaker system, you don't need to place it anywhere specific. Subwoofers are non-directional because they're low enough frequencies that we can't tell where it's coming from. Put it behind me, put it in front of me, put it over there. I won't even know. I'll just hear low frequency. But high frequency, we can really determine where it's coming from. Therefore, this all translates into how I mix. When I was mixing Madonna records, we have kick and snare and bass all in the center between the two speakers because you can't tell where it's coming from anyway. Pan the bass to the left, I wouldn't know it's coming from the left because I can't hear where it's directional. But shakers and hi-hats is where we get all of the syncopation of the rhythm, and those things you pan hard left and right because then your ears can actually perceive one rhythm coming from here, one rhythm coming from here, and them complementing each other. So when you mix, I generally think of low frequency information centered, lower mid-range information left, upper mid-range information right. If I've got a guitar that's picking some notes, I'll put it a little right, I'll put a piano a little left, and then super high frequencies like shakers, tambourines, and hi-hats and stuff I put further because that gives a better imaging and uses the space more efficiently.